Welcome to Season 2 of the My Story Podcast. The My Story Podcast features interviews with leaders, influencers, and entrepreneurs telling us their stories and the life lessons they've learned along the way. Hey everybody, it's Conrad Weaver. I am back for the second season for the My Story Podcast. I took the last couple months off, well, actually about 6 months off, as things got really busy for my day job. Many of you know that I'm a film producer, so I've been working on some new documentaries and the distribution of my new film, Heroine's Grip, which, by the way, is available on Amazon on Prime Video. So if you want to go over there and check it out on Amazon's Prime Video. It's a little shameless plug for Heroine's Grip. I'm really excited about this new season of the podcast. I've got some amazing people lined up and interviews that I've recorded over the past couple of months, and I can't wait to share them with you. And just to let you know, I'm always looking for new connections with leaders, influencers, and entrepreneurs. And so if you know someone you think would be a great interview, a good fit for the show, I would love it if you'd make a connection, make an introduction, send me an email, introduce me, introduce them, and hey, we'll see if we can get them on the show. That's how this works. And I'd love to get your friends and your connections on the show, people that you want to hear their story right here on the My Story Podcast. Hey, and if you enjoy these podcasts and think that more people should listen, well, I do too, give me a review on Apple Podcasts. That really helps the visibility of the show and gets other people interested in listening. So, and then if you would, just share this episode right now, share this episode with a friend or a couple of friends, send a text message or an email or through a Facebook post. I'd love it if you'd share it with someone. If you think it's valuable, if you think it has information that other people should hear, go ahead and click that button and send it to a friend. I'm so excited that the My Story Podcast is now available on Stitcher. If you're listening on the Stitcher app, please give me a shout out, leave a review, let me know. I'm glad that we're expanding the reach here on the My Story Podcast, and I'm excited to have that out there on Stitcher. So today on the show, I'm honored to feature my interview with Jedd Medefind. Jedd is the president of the Christian Alliance for Orphans organization, otherwise known as CAFO, C-A-F-O. And he's the president of this organization, and he's done so many things. Prior to his role at CAFO, he served in the White House as a special assistant to President George W. Bush, leading the Office of the Faith-Based and Community Initiatives. And he did amazing things there at the White House. Prior to that, he's held a range of posts in the California State Legislature. He helped establish the California Community Renewal Project, which strengthens nonprofits in some of the state's most challenged communities. He's studied and served and lived in more than 30 countries with organizations ranging from Price Waterhouse in Moscow to Christian Life in Bangladesh. He's written many articles. He's authored 4 books, including his most recent book called Becoming Home. And he lives right here in the Washington, D.C. area with his family, and it's been a privilege to get to know Jedd over the last number of years. And so today, he's right here on the show. And so here is my interview with Jedd Medefind. Well, welcome, Jedd, to the My Story Podcast. Thanks so much for coming on board today.
So glad to join you.
Yeah, so it's been, you and I met a number of years ago, I guess, through CAFO, the Christian Alliance for Orphans, right?
Yeah, I believe so.
And I remember attending that event back in, it was 3 years ago in Orlando. And I was part of a team from my church who came to Orlando for the conference or for the summit, and just was blown away by the things. I mean, I had never really been exposed to a lot of information or teaching or training on dealing with orphans. And so that was my first really exposure to this critical issue. And I know you're a part of that and have, been doing this for a long time. So tell me a little bit about who you are and what do you do so our audience can get a kind of a handle on that.
Sure. Well, the Christian Alliance for Orphans is a coalition of a number of about 200 different organizations that are all living out their faith in service to vulnerable children, from kids in local foster care here in the U.S. to orphaned and vulnerable children all over the world. And each of these organizations do great work on their own independently, but through CAFO, we're able to coordinate shared efforts where all of us are working together for outcomes that are bigger than any of us could achieve alone. And so some of that is kind of externally focused, really trying to inspire the church to be God's first answer for kids that are lacking the protection of family, stepping up as adoptive and foster families and mentors and serving and caring for kids in other ways as well. And then some of it is internal, really helping improve the quality and effectiveness of the work of Christian ministries and churches that are serving vulnerable children. And just with the goal that as Christians, we won't only be known for being passionate people with a lot of care for children, but that we are doing this in some of the most effective and innovative ways in the field.
Well, I want to get more into the state of what the orphan situation looks like around the world. But first, I want to kind of get into what motivated you to go down this path and how did you get to where you are today?
Yeah. Well, Conrad, there's always so many different threads that God weaves in your own story. And I look back on a lot of different things that long before I would have imagined myself in this role, I think God was preparing and weaving together. And for me, one of those threads was actually right after I graduated from college. I had been planning to go to law school, had been accepted, everything was on track. And then speaking with a number of folks who had gone into practicing law in large firms, just every one of them seemed to be not excited about their work. And I, of course, today know many people who are using their gifts and law degrees in very meaningful ways. But boy, that scared me and made me think, okay, I don't want to just go down this road thoughtlessly, come out with a lot of debt, have to take a big, well-paying job, and then wake up, 5 or 10 years later wearing golden handcuffs. And so I had 3 great friends, and the 4 of us together decided to at least initially defer graduate school for a year and spend that year instead living with committed followers of Christ in many different parts of the world. So in Central America, Russia, and Africa, and India, and other places. And long story short, this journey, as you would imagine, was just a life-shaping experience.
Sure.
Both the time with these 3 close friends of mine, they're still some of my very best friends, and that was incredibly rich and meaningful, but also being exposed to faithful followers of Jesus who within their own cultures were living out their faith in very vibrant and compelling ways. And one of the ways that we saw that just shining were Christians who were serving orphaned and vulnerable children within their own communities and context there. And so, even though this was not something I did initially, after that, that God was, I think, wedging just a concern for and a love for these precious kids that eventually would take the form of being able to be an advocate for them, working alongside many other Christians, both here in the U.S. and around the world.
So spending that, was it a year that you spent abroad?
A good part of a year, yeah.
Okay. What was the biggest surprise for you in that?
One of the biggest was that I think for the 4 of us, a large part of what motivated us was, we wanted to live with adventure. We wanted to live what we called an epic life. That's the language of a 22 or 23-year-old young man, right? And I look back on that, and I don't think we were off on our desire to live for things that were larger than just ourselves and that were more than just kind of climbing a corporate ladder or retiring on a golf course someday. That desire was right, but we were, I think, mistaken in where we thought we'd find it. We thought it was in always pressing to some new adventure, some new kind of extreme experience and going from this place to that. And what we really discovered is, no matter how crazy a place seems when you first arrive there, how exciting it is, you very quickly that adrenaline fades away and it really becomes an ordinary place, whether you're in the jungles of Africa or in the frozen tundra of Russia or anywhere else, the adrenaline fades. And so you're left with this realization, we're not going to find epic life just by continually pressing to new places. But what we did see is that people were living very extraordinary lives amidst ordinary circumstances within their own countries, within their own cultures, as they learned to follow Christ in those ordinary places, as they learn to love their neighbors well and sacrificially and put the needs of others above their own. That is what we came to conclude was where this life to the full is found, not in some next big adventure, but in learning to live well right in the place where God's put you.
Wow. I think that's something that every one of us needs to hear and learn and understand.
Yeah.
That
It's 20 years later and I feel like I'm still learning it, but I am so grateful for the gift of not imagining that I'm going to find that somewhere far off in some, big change of life, that it has to be found and then lived right here in the ordinary places.
So it's you were more than just going off to quote unquote find yourself, right? You were looking for that great thing, and I think you found that purpose. Would you say?
Yes, I really would. And of course, not that we came away with all the answers or any of those things, or were able to perfectly apply what we had learned. But I would say that that kind of the conclusion that as 23-year-old guys we came away with, which is that realization that the life to the full that Jesus promised isn't found in some high adrenaline venture or constant change or, any of those things. It is found in just being a humble, loving, self-giving person in the midst of ordinary places. And we saw some wonderful examples of that. And I'd say we've been seeking in our own imperfect but meaningful way to grow into that more and more over the last 2 decades since that time.
So you've had quite a bit of experience in the world and around the world since then.
That's right.
What was that path like for you?
Yes. Yeah. So, I ended up from there, long story short, when we returned, I had been planning to go to law school, had deferred for a year, but ultimately the four of us together had just felt so impacted by the people that we had spent time with and wanting to tell some of these stories and share some of these things that we experienced, that we felt a sense of shared calling to try to write a book about this. And we didn't know the first thing about writing or publishing or any of that. But long story short, we moved up to a cabin in the mountains, because that's right. What you do when you're going to try to write a book, right? And the four of us ended up writing a book together, and it was picked up and published, called Four Souls. And then we ended up doing some speaking and different things around that. But ultimately, I ended up going into the political realm. It wasn't, again, what I was necessarily planning on, but had an opportunity to work in the office of a state legislator in California, work on some campaigns, and then ended up working for many years in the legislature in California, and then came out to Washington, D.C. to work for President George W. Bush, helping lead the faith-based and community initiative for him, and very much loved that work in government and politics. I believe there's wonderful and very important work to be done in the political realm, and certainly good people are needed there as they are anywhere.
So what would you say is maybe your highlight for your time at the White House?
There were a lot of highlights. Certainly one of the biggest, if not the biggest, was just getting to work alongside some of the most remarkable people that I've ever met. People who are extremely talented and sharp, but at the same time, very substantive people, thoughtful people who wanted to use their gifts well for things of lasting impact. Many of them Christians and many of them not. But, I think one of the myths about Washington, D.C. is that it's full of people who just want to be rich and powerful. And, there's certainly many people who have been corrupted in the process of politics. But I would say that most of the people who go into politics, most of the people who move to Washington, D.C., do so because they really want to make a difference. They want to use their gifts and skills to make a difference for good in this world. And of course, I certainly wouldn't define good in the same way as many of the other people here. We disagree perhaps, very deeply on the best path and what's going to be best for our nation and what's going to most enable people to thrive. But most of the folks who move here do so because they want good and they want to make a difference. And that's a fun environment to be in. And of course, the White House in many ways is the epicenter of that, or one of the epicenters of that. And so it's just a privilege to work alongside and learn from and with people who are like that.
I've had the privilege of being on Capitol Hill numerous times doing interviews with various senators and Congress people in Congress, and just the buzz, the energy that's there is palpable.
Yes.
You walk the halls and you can just feel that there's things happening, and it's exciting.
Yes. And there can be something, that can be dangerous about that, in the sense that it can be
Sure.
intoxicating, right? And to feel you imagine that this is so important. It's so much more important than anything that's going on anywhere else. And that's why I do feel like it's really, really good for people to not stay in the beltway. When we speak of inside the beltway here, not to stay there for indefinite periods of time, but to work here for time and then be in other areas. And I actually, over the past decade after, we had lived on Capitol Hill during the time I worked in the White House, but then we moved back to California, rural California, and that's where I'm from. Right? My parents and brothers and sisters-in-law and relatives still live there, and it's a wonderful place. It's a humble place in many regards, but I feel like there was something very good and clarifying about spending most of the last 9 years living there, even though I have had the privilege of working on issues related to, global matters and national advocacy. To be based there, I think was helped remind me that, the most important things in many regards are not what happens in Washington, D.C. It's what happens amidst ordinary lives lived out in public schools and churches and neighborhoods all over the country. And I think that's, a lesson that probably many of us who live in Washington, D.C., and I count myself in that again now, need to be freshly reminded of on a fairly frequent basis.
Right. I know I've had the privilege of traveling out in the western parts of the country at times, and you're speaking to people in rural areas, and they say sometimes, I think the people in Washington, D.C. forget that we're out here. And they're not really connected to our issues and what's going on in on the ground.
Yeah, that's really true. And it does happen. I mean, and it's funny because I think people mistake and think that people who are in Washington are cut of different cloth, that they're not human in the same way, that they're, people in Washington, D.C. are ordinary people too. They, So they're actually not more devious or more cunning or more self-absorbed than other people necessarily, but they can forget what life in the heartland is like. And so those are important reminders, I think.
Sure. So you went from working in policy and working in the White House, working on really important issues like this. How did you make the move then to becoming the head of CAFO?
Yeah, well, while I was working in the White House, the Faith-Based and Community Initiative was the work that I was a part of, and we were really trying to reform and shift the way that government addressed deep human needs. So, whether we're talking about homelessness, returning prisoners, global HIV, the Faith-Based and Community Initiative was an effort to shift our method of problem solving from models that kind of centered and hubbed in Washington, D.C., focused on kind of the large machinery of government delivering the services, to instead saying, the center of transformation in these communities and lives has to be local organizations, local nonprofits, including faith-based groups, but not just faith-based groups. Those organizations that are rooted in communities, we want to put the center there and the central focus there. And what Washington can do potentially is help to, encourage that work where appropriate government can partner with that work. But the most important work has to be rooted in the community. It can't just come from Washington. And so we were engaging that and really seeking to reform all federal efforts to address human need with that vision in mind. A big part of that work had to do with vulnerable children. There was a number of mentoring programs. There were the president's HIV work, AIDS work in Africa. PEPFAR had a large orphan and vulnerable children focus. There was the adoption tax credit that was doubled under President Bush and other things. And so a big part of my portfolio had to do with that. And I loved working on those issues. As I mentioned, they were very close to my heart. And actually my wife and I at the time also, we had 2 biological children, but we were thinking about having number 3. And then we just really felt a shared sense of calling to adopt and to bring a child into our family that, otherwise would grow up without one. And so all these things were very much in my heart and mind. And so as the Bush administration was coming to its end and we were passing the torch to the new guys who were coming in to replace us, I had the invitation to step into this role. At the time, the Christian Alliance for Orphans was just a loose coalition of organizations that served vulnerable children in different ways, adoption agencies, foster care organizations, and then global orphan care organizations, all working together. And I was very impressed to see these ministries that in many ways were natural competitors with each other, but they were working together. And as I saw, they were accomplishing more together than any of them could on their own. And so I was very impressed with that. And when they asked if I would be someone to come in and give full-time leadership to this work together, I thought, wow, what could be a greater privilege than to get to pour myself into that? So that's what I have done ever since the end of the Bush administration.
So what are some of the big issues, challenges that these organizations face and that vulnerable children face around the world?
Yeah. Well, of course, you have both similarities and differences between issues in the United States and globally. Speaking in the United States, there's about 450,000 children on any given day that are growing up in the care of the government. They are wards of the state. They're in the foster system. They've been removed from their families through no fault of their own. They're not juvenile
delinquents. Almost
delinquents.
500,000.
That's right. That's right.
Wow.
And they need love. That's the number one thing. They need something government alone can't provide. And in some cases, that looks like a new family. About a quarter of the kids in the system are waiting to be adopted. They need a new forever family. And then about 3/4, the hope is that they can be cared for temporarily and then be safely returned to their biological family. And while that won't be the case for all of them, the hope and prayer is that they will be reunified. And so the need there is for people willing to step into their lives as foster parents, or perhaps in other contexts as well, as mentors, as what's called a casa, and be a temporary loving presence in their lives, and perhaps as a mentor, a lifelong, a permanent relational presence there, even if they're returned to their biological family. And then, of course, there's wraparound needs around that. So it's, even if you're not called to adopt or foster or mentor, there is much need to both support the adoptive and foster families that are caring for these kids, as well as for some to work with the biological families that are trying to reunite. And so what we often say is, not everyone is called to foster or to adopt, but everyone can play a part in this vision, living out what the book of James calls the pure and undefiled religion that includes caring for orphans and widows in their distress.
What are some of those things that just the average person can do now?
Yeah. Well, there really are, within many, many churches around the United States, a growing number of people who are fostering or adopting out of the foster system. But what's really needed just as much is what we call wraparound support for those families. So I'll just give a personal example. When my wife and I, this was a couple years back, and our foster care agency called and said, hey, we've got a newborn that was actually a preemie born 8 weeks early, and he needs a home right away tonight. And we were not anticipating that. Our youngest child at the time was 4, and so we didn't have any baby stuff. And yet we sensed that this was God's invitation to us, and so we welcomed this little guy home. But in this kind of big chaotic day of his arrival and all the different needs that came with that, people in our church heard about these needs and began showing up at our house with little tiny baby onesies that would fit his tiny little body, and with the formula we needed for a preemie baby, and with diaper cream, and with a diaper genie, and with a tiny little car seat. And actually they continued to bring meals over the next several months, several days a week, to help us along that journey. And so I will say, not only was that help very, very practical, it was something we just, wow, that help was immensely useful. At the same time, it told us, hey, you're not alone in this journey. Even there's times when it is very difficult or frustrating different ways, but we weren't walking that alone. There was a church community walking that with us. So I think that is just an immense gift. And it's a truly necessary gift that those who are fostering or have adopted or caring for vulnerable children or their families in different ways need that wraparound support.
So with these, almost nearly 500,000 vulnerable children here in the U.S., does that include what's going on at the border?
It doesn't. That would add another layer to that. And some of those children have actually been placed into foster-like context. Some in group homes, some in actual foster care, where they're in the home of a welcoming family. until they, kind of their longer term status can be determined. So that has added to the needs within the system.
Mm-hmm. And I want to ask this question, and if you choose not to go down this path, that's fine. We can edit that out. But what do you think is the answer to that crisis at the border, and what should we as followers of Christ be doing?
Yes, that is a big question, and I certainly would. I think there's a lot of people that would have wise insights on that. What from my vantage point, as working with children and families in the U.S. foster system and related needs, I would say, in the short run, if there's a child that is lacking the protection and care of family, that child is immensely vulnerable. Statistics show that the kids growing up without or living without the protection and care of family are some of the most vulnerable beings on our planet, to everything from forced labor to human trafficking, to isolation, disease, all manner of things. And so I think the people of God, regardless of any of the kind of the back political issues or those things, we are called to be that temporary protection and care for a child in that situation. And again, that's the short run answer. If there's a child without the protection of family, God's people are invited to step into that need. In the long run, one of the things that I would emphasize is that a lot of the immigration that's happening is tearing families in Central America apart. My family and I lived in El Salvador and Guatemala for 6 months a few years ago, and there were so many families there where the father had left, or other situations where the family had been torn apart, looking for work or looking for opportunity or other things going north. But what was left was a wreckage of children growing up without their father, particularly boys. And so I really believe that in the long run, the core answer has to be in helping strengthen communities, including business opportunities and job opportunities within these Central American countries. And one of the big pieces to that, there's multiple, but one of the biggest pieces to that is helping to deal with the security issues there, particularly with the gangs. So many good people in El Salvador, Guatemala, and the surrounding countries live in constant fear of the gangs. And so until you can deal with the security situation, it's going to be very hard to deal with creating businesses and job opportunities. And until you can create job opportunities, then people are always going to be streaming north looking for the income of jobs. And so, that's obviously, those are very deep waters, and I would not consider myself a foremost expert on these things by any stretch, but that would be, from my limited perspective, where we need to go.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really sad just from a observer looking at what's going on and hearing the stories, and this is really compelling as to, there's so much we should be doing to help, and sometimes I'm just like, I don't know what to do. I don't know what, so if someone, and I know you're not the leading expert at this, but if someone would say, hey, what can I do? What organizations should I contact? What would you say?
Well, there's a number of organizations, including Bethany Christian Services, which is a member of the Christian Alliance for Orphans, that are actually facilitating some of the short-term foster care for unaccompanied minors. And so reaching out to Bethany, or another one that might be in your region, would be one opportunity. I know that, they do work actually in Maryland, where you're based, and other places. So that would be one option. I think they also have, opportunities for volunteering and serving in other ways. Although there's, because of background checks and security issues, there's not always a lot of volunteers allowed in some of the facilities and things like that. And so I would recommend, that'd be one route, connecting with the organizations that are serving these children, and in some cases their families, where we are. But then the other is, there are many great organizations who are doing economic development and serving and helping families within Central American countries. And I think that is an equally worthy and important part of the picture as well.
So thinking and looking at the state of orphans and vulnerable children around the world and other areas, what kind of stands out to you? Where are the really desperate situations? What's going on around the world?
Yeah. Well, in some ways, you can point to hot spots, particularly, for instance, Africa, where HIV, at least, if you look back a decade or two, really ripped out the fabric of traditional society. So you had a whole generation of fathers and mothers dead. And so you had grandparents caring for grandchildren, but the traditional African means of caring for an orphan, which, being absorbed into the extended family, at the very case, many cases, that social fabric was torn, in some cases just ripped to shreds. And there's some healing that's happening there, but it's still extremely difficult. And in particularly in urban areas, there's high concentrations of children growing up apart from families, whether on the streets or in other situations. And so on one level, you could say certain regions of the world have particularly pressing need. But I would just really emphasize, every child who's growing up apart from the protection and care of a family is one of the most vulnerable beings on our planet. And there are children that fit that description in every country in the world, including our own. And I believe that God calls his people to be the first answer for those children. And it's going to look different in each place. The needs are unique. There's, in some cases, for instance, in a number of African countries and many other places, there are surviving relatives or perhaps even biological parents who, with some support, that child can return to be with them. And so that's always the ideal. If we can reunite biological families, that's the first and best option. But of course, even in those places and in many other places in the world too, there are, situations where kids cannot safely return to biological family. Certainly not in the short run, and maybe never. And so in those cases, working to encourage local systems that enable children to find new families through local adoption, if possible, or internationally, if there are not families readily available in a timely manner in that local place, and other services that enable really the local church to be the first answer for the people of that country, that really becomes a wonderful expression of the same heart that's lived out here in the United States in foster care.
So I know in every industry there are bad players. What are some red flags that people should look for when considering showing support for an organization?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, the reality is that, any good cause can attract bad actors, because if someone perceives, hey, if I will be perceived as compassionate, I can raise donations, that can draw bad actors into a particular field, and certainly caring for orphans would be one of those. And in some cases, they're bad actors where they're literally trying to take advantage of or traffic kids, or just truly, raise funds with their pictures and then pocket all the money themselves. And in other cases, they're well-meaning, but they're, perhaps by creating an orphanage and then needing to fill it so as to get more donations, they'll take kids out of families where they actually could, with a little bit of support, be raised within biological family or kin. And so both of those are situations to look out for. And I would recommend, as the Christian Alliance for Orphans, we have a membership process where we can feel a high degree of confidence in the integrity and trustworthiness and fiscal management of these member organizations. And so, if an organization is a member of the Christian Alliance for Orphans, I think churches and donors can feel confident in working with them and giving through them. And even as I say that, though, I'd say every organization has ways in which it can grow and improve and enhance the quality of the work it's doing. And so that's a big part of why CAFO exists as well, so that we can all learn and grow together to continually improve the quality of care we provide for children and for struggling families.
So it seems like, being immersed in this can be really daunting, can perhaps even be depressing. What are some of those stories and situations that you've heard that give you hope?
Yeah, that is so true, Conrad. And I think I will say this first, I have seen many individuals, and I think I would include myself in this in some ways, who have waded into this work, inspired and wanting to make a difference, and having been moved deeply by a particular story or a particular child they've known, and the heartbreak of that child losing the protection of parents and then growing up on the streets or in an orphanage and being taken advantage of by unscrupulous adults, and so we're moved into this by duty or by idealism or perhaps by guilt, whatever is moving us into it. And then as we wade in, we imagine we're going to solve these problems. We're going to fix it all. And what we find is that the needs and the problems are often far more complex than we imagined, and that the situations don't yield to our best efforts the way we had imagined they would. And so we could and can really lose our hope, our joy, our spark in this work. And that's why I just feel like it is so important that that we, at our deepest level, be motivated in this work, not by duty or by guilt or by idealism alone, although those things may have their place, but if they are not going to carry us the distance when things get really tough, and things will get really tough. And it's what carries us the distance is if we say, God himself has loved me and pursued me and drawn me into his family, and his love has been poured out into my life. And so my desire is simply to go and do likewise, that we love because he first loved us. And so that really does need to be the wellspring, or we're just going to become cynical, burned out, folks, whether working in the field or advocates in Washington, D.C. or otherwise. But when we have that as our wellspring, when we are loving simply because we have been loved first, and then God invites us to go and do likewise, then when things are wonderful and we're seeing the success that we hope for, wow, we can just rejoice and celebrate in that. And when things are tough and not all we'd hoped, we can still say, I'm going to continue to love just with that same perseverance with which God continues to love me, even at, in the moments when I'm not responding in the way I would hope. And so, so that's a great thought there. And it's just so important, I think, for all of us to grasp. Conrad, you asked about, encouraging stories. And, I will say one of the things, I'm seeing many churches in many different parts of the world stepping up for the orphans of that place. I was in Guatemala last fall, and there was a conference. More than 800 Guatemalans had gathered in Guatemala City saying, we want to be God's first answer for the orphans of this place. And that encouraged my heart so much. They weren't, while they're certainly still welcoming the help of American and other Western donors, and there's wonderful partnerships to be had there, they're also saying, we're not just going to wait for people to come in from the outside and solve our needs here. We, as the body of Christ in Guatemala, want to be the first answer for that. And so that just gives me joy. And I see that happening in Kenya and in Russia and Ukraine and many other parts of the world as well. And it's the same spirit that I'm seeing in many local churches, whether in some cases big mega churches, others very small house churches, or everything in between in the United States, that are saying kind of the same thing. Hey, we're going to be the answer for the kids in the foster system in our county, in our zip code. We're not going to be overwhelmed by these huge national statistics. We're going to count the number of kids in our zip code, and we want to be the answer for them as a church. And so that just inspires my heart as well.
Yeah, I've seen that personally in Ukraine and the work that I've been privileged to do and be a part of, just seeing the local folks there on the ground, just really having a passion, a compassion for these kids and working with them. So it's exciting to see that.
Definitely.
So on a little bit of a different note here, on a personal level, what do you do to keep yourself motivated, inspired, encouraged with you and your family and that kind of thing? What's the process there?
Yeah, that's a great question, because as we were talking about a moment ago, it is so easy to become weary in doing good, to become exhausted, to be spent. I think in the story in the Gospels where the woman with the bleeding disease reaches out and touches Jesus in the crowd, as you may remember, and he turns around and he says, who touched me? And people said, of course someone, tons of people touched me. He said, no, I know that someone touched me because power has gone out from me. And that phrase, power has gone out from me, I think that really is the essence of all ministry, that in one way or another, whether working for the physical healing of others or emotional healing, or just sitting with them through grief that they have experienced, there is some form of life and energy that it pours out from us by God's grace to others. And that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. Jesus modeled it for us, and it's what we're called to do, whether we're adoptive or foster parents or mentors or running an organization or volunteering. But life is flowing out from us. And so if life is not flowing in, at that same rate, if we're not turning to God and with our hands open to receive the fresh life that he intends to give us, then we will run dry. And I've experienced that myself. I've seen it in many others in this field. And so having habits and practices that sustain us for the long journey are truly essential.
Wow. And so what are some of those practices that you do?
Yeah, well, I would point to several, and that really I and the whole CAFO team actually try to practice on a daily, weekly, and annual basis. And on a daily basis, that is the first moments of the day before I will turn on my smartphone and allow others or advertisers or news people or any other people to determine what my first thoughts of the day are. I leave my phone on airplane mode, and I want to spend the first moments of the day in the presence of my good Father. And in scripture, in prayer, in perhaps journaling or memorizing scripture, but to do that each day. And other people may do it at different times of the day, although I think there's a certain special gift to do it as the very first thing before any other thoughts come crowding in, before technology starts binging and bleeping at us. And so I would say that would be one, is having time with our Father each day. Weekly, I would really, really encourage a practice of Sabbath. And not in a legalistic sense that, that we're somehow, that God's mad if we don't take a day of weekly Sabbath. But I really believe that it's a gift that he wants to give to us. He's saying, it's kind of like someone saying, I have the keys to a vacation home, a beautiful vacation home on the coast, and I want to give you these keys. And he's not necessarily, he's not going to be mad if we don't take it, but we're missing out if we don't receive that gift. And So I believe that gift is to receive a day that does not have any thing on our to-do list on it, that we literally make this sacred and we put walls on either side of that day. For me, that starts usually at sundown on Saturday and goes to sundown on Sunday. And during that 24 hours, I'm instead of work, I'm instead receiving the gifts of worship and of rest and of play. So those three things, rest, worship, and play, that's what that time is for. That's what God wants to give us as his children. And again, we don't have to do this, but he's intending this gift for us. And I would say I struggle with this because so often I feel like, if my to-do list is so long, how can I possibly afford to take this time? I almost feel like I'll be more rested if I keep working, because at least then my to-do list will be shorter at the end of it, hopefully. But the reality is, when I do make that choice, and my wife Rachel and I have gotten into that rhythm and really, for the most part, kept it for the last more than 15 years now. It is the highlight of the week, and those walls that hold out the to-do list, they create a space inside that really does feel sacred. And it feels sweet in a way that no other time does, because it is almost a different experience of time. And so I would commend that, especially to those who are in justice and mercy work, who are pouring themselves out. This is one of the prime ways that God wants to pour into us.
Boy, that's so valuable information and encouragement. So thank you for that. And that's something that I do in a way, but I can certainly have a long way to go to really make that a absolute priority in my life. And so that's great encouragement. So thank you. So what are some of the books, or who are some of the leaders or people that have most influenced you along your way, along your journey? Yeah,
well, one that I've really valued a lot is Dallas Willard. He was the chair of the philosophy department at USC, recently deceased, but just an amazing legacy of being very, very thoughtful, wise, engaging the broader world, the broader culture, but at the same time, really rooting everything he did in a vision for the kingdom of God, and seeing the kingdom, which Jesus talked about more than any other theme, is the kingdom is where God's good purposes, his will, are breaking forth into this broken world. And, anywhere God's will is perfectly, fully carried out, that's where his kingdom is. And so, heaven is the kingdom of God, but we also pray, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so when we're aligning our will and our work with God's will, that's where the kingdom of God breaks forth. And that's, to me, it's just an exciting and beautiful vision. And that's what I see the work of the Christian Alliance for Orphans being about, is that we're seeking to bring the kingdom of God to break forth in the lives of struggling children, orphans, broken families, and to bring the healing and restoration that God intends. And so I feel like Dallas Willard articulates that so well. He also speaks a lot about the spiritual practices and disciplines that sustain us and underlie the heart transformation that has to happen in us before we can be bearers of the kingdom. So I value that. If I, just as a starter, he can be quite heady and substantive. And so there's a book, though, that's called Renovation of the Heart in Daily Practice. And it's a very accessible volume, quite slender, but it really gives a good, just exposure and introduction to the big ideas that Dallas Willard shares. So I'd highly commend that. Going further back in history, I've just loved George MacDonald, and many people haven't heard of him, maybe have read some of his fairy tales and stories like The Princess and the Goblin or The Princess and Curdie. But he, even if we've never heard of him, he has had a profound impact on most of us through C.S. Lewis, Dorothy Sayers, J.R.R. Tolkien, and others who considered him kind of their prime forefather. And look to him and his ideas and as profoundly shaping in their thinking and writing. And so as I've gotten to know George MacDonald more directly over the past 10 years or so, reading a number of his biographies and some of his writings and poetry and sermons and works, I've found a man that embodies not just some of these ideas, he's a great thinker, those things, but he lived this, he embodied that sweetness and the joy that I want to live with. And as he grew older, he became more childlike. And I think that's one beautiful thing that I think, oh man, what a wonderful thing to think of. I'm 44 now, but what if I'm 54? When I'm 64, I'm much more childlike than I am now, that my eyes are brighter, that I'm more joyful, that I'm more sensitive, and I cry easier at things that deserve tears, either tears of joy or tears of sorrow, that I'm more delighted in sunrises and in the beauty of God's creation, all those things. I think George MacDonald grew that way. I want to as well.
Very cool. So a couple more questions before we wrap up. One, what are some of the big life lessons you've learned over the years? And you've kind of talked about that a little bit, but maybe what's one that really stands out?
Yeah. Well, certainly one is one that we talked on earlier, which was just the idea that, life to the full that Christ promised, that he invites us to, isn't found out there in some far off place. It's found right in the ordinary place where we are right now, learning to live fully for him and to love our neighbors well amidst ordinary life. Now, eventually, God may call us to some far-off place, but we can't imagine that just, for instance, hey, I'm going to become a missionary and move to Timbuktu, that is somehow going to transform our heart and make us more useful for the kingdom. It's just going to change our location, but we very much can be just as grumpy and self-absorbed in Timbuktu as we are here.
Yeah, we carry ourselves with us, don't we?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so if we haven't learned to love our neighbor well here, we're really not going to do it well there. And in fact, I think it actually may amplify some of our selfishnesses and quirks to be in some far off place. So that would be maybe number one. But closely related to that is just the reality that the biggest decisions we have to make are not these big decisions about where we're going to live or even what job we'll take. Those things that we consider the big decisions. The biggest decisions we make are these small decisions we make every day about how am I going to respond to this person in front of me who's really irritating me? How am I going to respond to the driver who cuts me off? How am I going to respond when someone asks me for money on the street? Am I going to walk away and not look at them? Am I going to slip them money but not give them eye contact? Or maybe not give them money but look them in the eye and start a conversation with them? How will I respond to my spouse when they're going through a really hard time and maybe being a little bit selfish? How am I going to respond to that in love and in self-giving? Those decisions, those are the most important decisions in life.
So on a personal level, when the movie about your life is made, what would the log line be?
When I first saw you were going to ask that, I thought to myself, man, I don't know if I want to come up with something there. I feel like I'm getting to live in a wonderful story that God is writing, and I don't know that I'm going to know the log line to this point by any stretch. But I would say what I might hope for would be a phrase, something like an outpost of hope. And I just see so much ache and hurt in this world. And so being an outpost of hope, being an outpost of God's grace amidst that hurt, I would love for that to be said of me and my family and the wonderful people I get to work with at CAFO.
I really like that. And I think what you have done over the course of your life so far has been an outpost of hope, just from what I've been able to see from my vantage point.
Thank you,
So,
Conrad.
yeah, that's great. That's great. What's the next big thing for you?
Well, we're really excited about what's called the More Than Enough vision, working across the United States with Christian churches and organizations all over the country towards a shared goal, which is by 2025 to see that there are more than enough loving families for every child in foster care. And that would include adoptive families, biological families that have been restored, as well as foster families. It's all three. And then the churches supporting those families, wraparound support. And I know, there's a lot of big visions and goals out there. This is one of those that actually is achievable. We really could get to the place where there are more than enough loving homes for every kid in foster care, where there really is more families waiting for children than children waiting for families. And that is a thrilling thought for the church to be known for that kind of thing, for the people of the country to look on and say, hey, there may be some things I don't like about those Christians, but man, they are the ones that welcome in kids that no one else wants. Man, I would love for the church to be known for that kind of thing.
That would be incredible. I mean, in the society, in the world that we live in today, I think that kind of thing would just be really what Christ asked us to do, right?
Absolutely.
I mean, that's who we're supposed to be.
Yeah. And it's who he is towards us, right? He has welcomed us first. So we can just give a small, humble reflection of that.
Absolutely. Well, it's been just a wonderful privilege to spend this time talking with you and about what you do and about the work the important work that you're doing and leading from around the world. How can people contact you or your organization? What's the best way to get in touch with you?
Yeah, well, CAFO.org, so CAFO.org is our website. And of course, there's doorways from there into all manner of different ways to engage, from, global work, wonderful organizations doing tremendous work all over the world, to U.S. foster agencies, and many of the things that we do together through CAFO. So our annual conference, the summit, where you and I first met, and many other things as well, monthly webinars and training and support for churches that are trying to build this wraparound support for adoptive and foster families, and many other things as well. So certainly would welcome anyone to visit us there. And there's an info email address that's accessible on the site. If anyone has questions or desires help in any particular area, that's what we're here for.
Awesome. Very good. Well, Jedd, it's been a wonderful experience to talk with you, and thank you so much for coming on the My Story podcast. I really appreciate your time and the effort to do this.
My joy, Conrad. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about things that matter.
So that's the show for today. Thank you, Jedd, for taking time to talk to us today. I really enjoyed our conversation and look forward to hearing more about what you are doing and what CAFO is doing here in the U.S. and around the world. Hey, be sure to come back next week for my special interview with Michael O. Seibel. Michael is an accomplished filmmaker, director, producer, and a writer. He's worked in Hollywood and on a number of major films, and has worked with organizations like the Billy Graham Association and others. He's produced documentaries about Chuck Colson, about Zamperini, and it's a fascinating interview and a look at what goes on in Hollywood and kind of his path to what he's doing today. And so be sure to check it out next week right here on the My Story podcast. The music on today's show is from my friend Drew Davidson. You can get all his music on iTunes or Spotify or at drewdavidson.com. Last, if you have an idea for the show, an interview you'd like to hear, send me a message and I'll see what I can do. Thanks so much for listening. I'll talk to you again next week on the My Story podcast.